We're talking about regulations that affect every single person in the country. That cost, it was estimated at one point, £2.5 billion a day to the economy, that caused, as a result of that, and as a result of shutting down the NHS, and as a result of all sorts of other factors, enormous consequences for public health, as well as, of course, its fundamental attacks on freedom. And we're told that the precedent you have to look to is the East Side cheese case.
Did you expect in the various court hearings, did you expect the judiciary to take a more detailed look at the science that the government based their decisions on? And are you surprised that it didn't?
I did, but I'd like to approach it in a slightly different way, which is that the idea that this is just a matter of looking at the science in detail presupposes that it could ever be justified to impose these sorts of measures. And my view is that it couldn't be. Certainly, perhaps if there was something like the plague or Ebola, perhaps it could be. Perhaps in certain limited circumstances. Although we've had Ebola in African countries, and nothing like this was done then. And in fact, because Ebola is so serious, it kills people so quickly, it doesn't spread. And so there is. If a pandemic is less is more transmissible, it will generally be because it is less serious, such as this virus. And there is a certain logic, therefore, to not imposing the most strenuous measures. But the unprecedented nature of this in itself called for analysis of what was being done and the justification for it on democratic grounds. But we didn't necessarily consider the scientific evidence, but that was only one part of it. And even if the point we made was that firstly, there is considerable scientific dispute, but secondly, even if you accept the scientific evidence as itself, as it is, you still cannot you cannot come to the conclusion that this is most certainly or unarguably proportionate unless you weigh that against the harms that will be caused. And that doesn't involve a detailed digest or detailed consideration of the evidence. It requires considering harms and considering evidence of harms. And that's not evidence of science. That is evidence of what will happen as a result. And some of those harms are harms to democratic rights, which are as close to absolute as they should be. And so the right to protest, for example, is not absolute in the sense that certainly it can be restricted on individual levels. And certainly it's right to do so. You can't just block off the highway every day, but absolute prohibitions on protest. It's difficult to see any circumstances in which that can be justified. So this is the kind of thing. But what the real problem that I had with the way in which the judgment was approached is that the judgment referred to a number of, and the judgment and the government in support of its position, referred to a number of cases, all of which dealt with esoteric and frankly minor, certainly in comparison to this, pieces of scientific evidence. So, for example, the British American tobacco case, which concerned tobacco advertising. East Side cheese was a case, and that involved, as the title suggests, scientific evidence about cheese regulation. There was one about salmon fisheries, and there was one about mink farms. And so these were all actual cases that were relied upon by the government and accepted by the Court of Appeal with, frankly, very little reasoning at all, as being precedents for saying, well, you can't assess the scientific evidence in detail because you rely on experts. Well, of course, the courts aren't going to intervene on the minutiae of the scientific evidence in respect of advertising cigarettes or of mink farm regulation or of cheese, and nor should they. And there's very good reason for that. And so there might be arguments either side, and there were in the BAT case, but obviously one can see the logic behind that. But this is not that kind of thing. We're talking about regulations that affect every single person in the country. That cost, it was estimated at one point, £2.5 billion a day to the economy, that caused, as a result of that, and as a result of shutting down the NHS, and as a result of all sorts of other factors, enormous consequences for public health, as well as, of course, its fundamental attacks on freedom. And we're told that the precedent you have to look to is the East Side Cheese case. And the other point to make is that the central case on proportionality, the test that the courts should apply, was the test made by Lord Sumption when he was sitting as a judge, but with the unanimous agreement of the Supreme Court in only about 2014, a case called Bank Mellet, and that set out 4 principles. They were not even mentioned by the Court of Appeal. Now, one might generously say they were in contemplation, but it's interesting that they didn't mention that, and yet they mentioned a case involving cheese regulation. And they used those precedents to say that somehow any kind of proportionality test against the most intrusive, and in fact, the remark that you quoted just now was made by a single Lord Justice of Appeal when he was giving permission for us to be heard by the full court. It wasn't actually in the judgment. And again, the judges in the Lord Chief Justice and others unfortunately skated over the seriousness and the gravity of these restrictions in a way that he didn't. But it was quite extraordinary, I thought, that we have to go back to minutiae of looking at scientific evidence in very particular and specific instances where expert evidence is there and the government has a wide discretion, quite rightly, as to what it does, or public bodies do. And that is how you apply the consideration of scientific evidence that is used to justify uncontemplated, not just unprecedented, but uncontemplated restrictions on the whole of society with unfathomable and possibly even consequences that might never be known, both to our democratic system, to our freedoms, to our psychology, to the future way in which children behave. Perhaps, who knows? We can't know the consequences, and we might never know. And yet that we go back to a case about cheese regulation, which is the one the government cited and the Court of Appeal accepted. I find that pretty extraordinary.